we're going to learn a little bit about graphics when using them in a stereoscopic 180 VR project. Okay, so what I have here is a shot made with the Canon R5C with the dual fisheye lens, and all it is just swinging back and forth. And we're going to do two things to it. First is put a title on it, and second, we will matte it and sort of only show a portion. Both of these are relatively easy with regular footage or even with monoscopic VR footage. They're pretty doable, but there's an extra wrinkle when you start dealing with stereo. So as you might have noticed, stereo footage is handled as either side by side, like this is. So this is like left eye here and right eye over here. Or sometimes we can encode it over under, but the principles end up being the same either way. So if we put a title on this first clip, I would normally do that in Premiere by going up to Graphics and Titles and then choosing New Layer and Text. And here in the Effect Controls panel, I can twirl this text section open and adjust things like the font and the font size. And in this case, for working with text in VR, I really want to use this as a setup, but not as like a design or like placement tool. I'll explain why in a minute, but the short answer is that it gets all messed up if you start trying to place it on your composition just using this tool. So what I really want to do is choose my font and then make it as large as possible because we'll be adjusting scale in another tool in a moment. I'd also like to center align this because the centering really helps with the tool we're about to use to place it in VR. Finally, if I just slowly double click on the text itself on the program monitor, I can actually type what I want it to say. So I'm going to say VR in 3D, just for something fun to do. So I think normally if you're used to editing not in VR, you would just start moving this to where you want it to be. But we got two problems. One is that if we move text in VR, as you might have seen in some of my other tutorials, it gets all bent and warped as it gets away from the center. The closer it gets to the bottom or top, the more it doesn't look like you intended it to. So we need a helper tool for that. So we'll be using the effect VR plane to sphere to move this planar or flat video title into spherical video, VR video. And we've done that in previous tutorials, so that's not new if you've worked with this stuff before. But what is new here is that now there's two eyes. And what goes on in stereoscopic video is that the left eye is different than the right eye. And then our brain kind of combines them. Well, the problem is right now, this VR in 3D is not in either eye. And if we indeed toggle to VR video, you'll see it sort of doesn't end up anywhere here. And if you put it in headset, you would see it like only, you would see the V and the in on the far right side of the left eye, and you would see the R 3D on the far left side of the right eye. So none of that's good. That would look very uncomfortable to the viewer. So what we do is go in the Effects tab, and if you search VR, you get like every VR effect. So I'm going to grab VR plane to sphere, and I will just drag it and drop it on our title. All right, so far so good. So this is in part why we start with as big of text as we can, because the VR plane to sphere effect, it tends to look a little smaller once we've added that. Luckily, though, there is a scale in VR plane to sphere. So we can scale it up if we like. And just for round numbers, I'm going to do 100. So you'll notice if you've never used this before, it looks a little curvy when we're not in VR, but that's actually to counteract the curve that VR creates, because VR is spherical video. So in VR, it looks perfectly flat because it's a little convex or like bulged in not VR. So the other thing that we can do now is under VR plane to sphere rotate projection, we can move this either down or up. And likewise, you'll see it kind of bend, but that's a counter bend to what's going on so that we can still see it correctly in VR. And this is just all working with the equirectangular projection that we use to encode VR. So I'm going to put this here. And so far, so good. If that's all you wanted to do, like if you just wanted a title in stereo, luckily the auto VR properties for VR plane to sphere are picking up the properties of this sequence. And because the sequence is set in stereo, it's making this stereo automatically. But what we're missing out on is the fact that part of the fun of stereo is that things look 3D. So with this title being the exact same placement in left and right eye, it actually won't look very 3D at all. It'll just sort of be like a flat graphic that's kind of like over top of the imagery that is photographed in 3D with this camera lens. Okay, so what I'd like to do is take this a step further and animate some 3D simulations onto it, you know. So my sample footage, I'm swinging towards the camera. And obviously, as things get closer, they get bigger. So one thing we can animate is scale in VR plane to sphere. So to quickly set keyframes and animate in Premiere, you just click the toggle animation button, which looks like a little stopwatch icon next to whatever you're about to change. So we're going to change the scale of VR plane to sphere. We're not going to use the scale on graphics or any of the other scales you might find, just the one on plane to sphere. So I'm setting a keyframe when the feet are as close to the camera as possible, and then I'll set another one when they're not. And you can use these arrows to hop back and forth. And we'll just have the big one be about 120. The further away will be less, you know, so maybe here we'll do one that's back to 100. Here we're gonna do 100, and here we're back to 120. And you see, as I change the settings, it changes the, it adds a keyframe rather. So far so good. Now we have animation that goes from big to little as I'm swinging, right? And if this first one didn't pick up the 100, I'll go back and force that. So we go from big to little, big to little. And that gives us part of the effect. That's like a decent fake scale change. But we still haven't utilized the 3D effect because it's doing the same thing in both eyes. And that's where this next setting becomes useful. So stereo disparity is the trick that will actually separate the two eyes a little bit. So if we turn it up, you'll see the titles move like off center. So they're a little bit different in terms of placement in each eye. And you can see that that's like the parallax thing that's going on. Like if you hold, you know, your hand close to your face and close one eye and then open the other and vice versa, you'll see like things that are close to you have a lot of stereo disparity. They're different from eye to eye. Things that are far have very little stereo disparity. So we can use this as like a helper effect. So I'm actually going to turn on the toggle animation in stereo disparity, and I'll do a very similar thing. I'm going to go through all the keyframes and just like expand the stereo disparity as the text is supposed to get closer. Now the trick is I'm looking at this on a 2D screen, just a regular monitor, and there's really no way currently as set up for me to check like, well, how is this looking? But luckily there is a setting we can turn on to see that. If you right click on the image itself on the program monitor and go to VR video, under settings, you can set up the viewport, here, like how many degrees are we seeing in the horizontal. I've already customized this. I kind of like mine in 180 in the horizontal and 90 in the vertical, so I can kind of keep that 2:1 aspect ratio when I'm looking at the VR version as well as when I'm looking at the equirectangular. But the trick is with stereo, there's a stereoscopic view choice, and we can either choose the left eye or the right eye. But if we choose anaglyph and hit OK, then the VR video display button actually goes red, blue, 3D. And if you've got a pair of red, blue 3D glasses, which I always keep by my desk, then you can actually test the 3D effect right here on your monitor without having to make an export or try to put a draft MP4 onto your headset to test or something like that. So now I'm gonna, with anaglyph on, I'm gonna go from the first keyframe on scale and jump to the second where it's supposed to be close to the viewer. And I'm just gonna turn up stereo disparity. Now, I'm telling you, this goes way further than you would ever want. Like if you were way up at the top of the scale for stereo disparity, your viewer's eyes will not like bring those two images together and think that it looks like one thing. It's going to look like double vision. So with glasses on, you actually want to test this with glasses on. I'm finding that for me, that the absolute edge of where I can still make this out as one image is like up near maybe 15 for me. But you really want to test this with glasses on, and then like maybe before you finish test a version in your headset. So for sake of argument, I'm going to go with like 10 as my absolute closest. And then I'm just going to hop to the next frame, and this one is going to be 0. Hop to the next keyframe, and this one's back to 10, and we're just following that pattern. The last thing I would do here is when we watch this, we see that the swing is like real smooth, natural movement that kind of slows to a stop before it swings back. Whereas the VR title has this really kind of linear, herky-jerky movement. And so that's a classic issue with sort of keyframe-based animation. If you just drag a selection box on all these keyframes, you can right-click them, and instead of the motion being linear, you can choose something like Bezier, which is going to make more of like a curve, where the changes kind of accelerate and decelerate as they get towards the keyframes. So this would just make for more natural motion. And now this text is going to not only get larger in scale, but also appear to actually become closer in depth in Z space in terms of the viewer's view of the text. So this isn't like real 3D animation like in After Effects or something like that, but it does achieve the end goal here of getting more sort of stereo depth out of the text. The other thing that I want to show you in terms of using graphics. And for now, I'm going to hop back out of Anaglyph VR mode. So the other thing I want to do is show you what it would be like to try to make like a portal, and essentially crop or matte some of this footage. So I've seen some example projects, some other VR films that have used this, where it's like instead of using the entire 180, we're just going to punch in, or at least like matte in to a portion of it, but still use the stereo. And that could be a window onto, like, there could be layers where there's another 360 or 180 footage on a track, below. So I have a file here that I made in Photoshop, and it has layers, and it's a PSD file. So I'm going to drag it in to import it into my project. And then when I import, I want to, instead of merging all the layers, I want to keep them as individual layers. And then I'm going to hit OK. And so that brings each layer in as its own file inside a folder. And it so happens my layer 2 here is going to function like a matte. It's just a black circle, but this is going to be useful because instead of just using the matte tool on stereo footage, which won't work because the matte won't be the same on both eyes. It won't be like duplicated like the way this title is duplicated. We're going to use this image as a track matte key. So that's another effect. So we're going to go in our effects tab, and this time I'm just searching for track matte key. And this lives in the keying video effects folder. If you drag this track matte key, this time, this might be counterintuitive, but we need to drag this to the footage we want to see, the footage we want to matte, not to the matte, if that makes sense. So I'm dragging it to the footage of swinging, and then the track matte key effects controls asks what track the matte is on. So the matte is video 2. So now it's treating that video 2 as a matte, which means it's only going to show the stuff that's inside, and it's just going to crop out all the rest. So far so good. We've matted the footage. The downside, of course, is that it's matting, the right side of the left eye and the left side of the right eye. So we need to use our handy dandy VR plane to sphere again, which is going to duplicate in each eye a matte, so now we've got a stereo matte that is centered in each eye. Once again, we can do scale changes here, and we can do rotations here so that we get the right placement for our matte. And if we were just trying to make a matte that got rid of the edges, and now we sort of have a 3D portal that could be used as a composite over top of other footage or something, then we've done it. We're good. But part of the reason why I did this as a PSD with multiple layers is I wanted to have a little decorative border around the footage, just to give it a little extra polish. So I'm going to bring in these additional layers. Layer 1 is kind of like a golden, like, Celtic knot sort of design. And layer 2 is just a black background so that nothing shows through the empty space between the knots. So this also should have VR plane to sphere put on it. But just as a trick, in case you didn't know or forgot, you can copy the settings of an effect just by selecting the clip that has the effect and doing Control or Command C. And then I can right click on a clip I want it to go to and choose Paste Attributes. And then I can just select only the things I want to copy. So in this case, I only want to copy the plane to sphere effect. And now this gets the exact same settings that the other plane to sphere effect had. The last thing I want to do here is when I look in VR, once again, The swinging has depth information, but of course this flat graphic that I made in Photoshop does not. Now, just with a Photoshop graphic, we'll never get it to be like each of these individual strands has its own depth or anything like that. But we could make the whole ring stand out from the background if we want. And again, we would just do that by altering the stereo disparity setting on VR plane to sphere. So in this case, what I'd like to do is on the golden ring, I just want the stereo disparity to be just a small amount, like 2 is plenty here, because all I want to do is make it appear like it's in front of the furthest back layer, like the sky back here. If you look at this with red-blue glasses, the sky now appears to be deep behind the golden braid. When we had it on 0, your eye doesn't quite know what to do with that in terms of depth. Like, where is it exactly? Is the gold behind the sky? Is it in front of? It ends up looking a little peculiar. And so I'm just pushing it forward just a little bit so that the effect kind of ends up where the braid is in front of the sky, but the feet are in front of the braid. And that ends up looking as intended, you know, kind of in the VR headset. So those are just some tricks you can do in Premiere if you're working in stereo VR to make sure your flat graphics that you might put on things like titles, credits, lower thirds, or simple motion graphics or visual effects have a little bit of a sense of depth to them in relationship to the other stereo footage that you captured on camera.